So a couple of weeks ago I was at the Royal Armouries in Leeds with Curator of European Edged Weapons, Iason Tzouriadis. Now that gave me a fantastic opportunity to film some additional material with him. The reason I was actually there is because of the launch of the second batch of the Royal Armouries Windlass Matt Easton collaboration line of replicas. And in fact I'm going to stick a link down below to those here and also to the Royal Armouries socials. They've got their own YouTube channel and all sorts of socials you should follow. So I'm going to stick a load of links down there to that stuff. But what we're going to look at here in this video is an interesting topic around the survival bias and survival conditions and the way that different ancient weapons survived down to the present day. Now obviously on this channel I sometimes go to museums and I sometimes go to auction houses and things like that, and I'm often looking at medieval, sometimes even older weapons, or indeed things like these Renaissance rapiers and side swords and things like this from the 16th, 17th centuries, all the way through to 19th and 20th centuries, and we find many different weapons survive or don't survive. Why is that? And the ones that come down to us, why do they look the way that they do? The patina, the corrosion, the pitting, and what does this tell us? It's a really, really important thing. What does this tell us about how they were used and how they survived to the present day? So I hope you enjoy this video with Iason Tzouriadis at the Royal Armouries. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm here with Iason at the Royal Armouries. He's the Curator of European Edged Weapons, and so he's the perfect person to be talking to you about these three swords. Now, you will hopefully by this point realise that these are the next three swords that have been replicated for the second batch, the first half of the second batch of the Royal Armouries Windlass plus me collaboration. And there are going to be videos about each of these, really in-depth videos, on the Royal Armouries YouTube channel, which I will link down below. But given that we've got these three swords here, I thought this is a really rare and valuable opportunity to talk about preservation and condition of swords, medieval and Renaissance swords, and what we can establish, presume, assume, or kind of work out about how they might have survived and where they might have come from. So, generally speaking, where do medieval and Renaissance swords come from? I guess they can be found in armouries.
Yeah, like they can survive in personal or public collections. Yeah, they can survive in usually in people's attics. You'd be surprised by how many privately owned. But more than often, these are found in muds or water deposits. Yeah, and we'll talk about this a bit later. Yeah, sometimes in churches. Yeah, in the context of England.
So very simply, I think we've kind of got archaeologically, or armorial, kept by people. Yeah, pretty much. So basically kept by the earth,
or found,
or kept by people. Yeah. So what's interesting here is we've got two weapons. One that we know was kept in an armoury for a very, very long time. One that we can assume was kept in some armory, type of collection house or something, and one which might possibly have come from a church, and we're going to explain why we think that might be the case. But we also have swords in the museum here which are Castillon swords, which came out of a river, the River Dordogne, at least we believe so. And you've also got swords which came out of the ground as well, haven't you?
Correct.
So let's talk about those. So shall we start with in a way, the easiest one? So this is one of the Alexandria swords, isn't it?
Okay.
So how were these kept?
I mean, it depends on the conditions of the armoury, and then we have examples, because the purpose of this video is how do we look at the surface of a sword, and can this tell us anything? And I have to sort of preface this with my knowledge on this is superficial. Like I'm on this from a curatorial perspective. I have a background in archaeology, but I'm not a conservator. No. Which I think to get like the final opinion in this, you need the help of a conservation team, and we have a very good conservation team here in the armouries. Sure. So you can see the first thing that you look on the surface of the blade, and because when we're talking about late medieval, early modern swords, they are made of a ferrous metal, which means that it corrodes quite easily if exposed to certain conditions, and that creates a certain patination and certain marks on the surface. In the case of the sword from the Arsenal of Alexandria, I think it's an interesting example because you can see it has been preserved in such a good condition, which means possibly a dry environment, not much collected rust. There are some traces of clean rust here, but we do not know when that was. I have to check the records in the museum because this rust could well have been modern. So you see examples of this in many collections with several objects that have been there for a couple of centuries. If there's proper conditions and they're not moved and they're aired decently, there's not much corrosion on the blade. There's only slight patination sometimes. So what this tells me is it was either based on the conditions of the quillons as well. This could have been hanging from the pommel. It could have been hanging from the quillons, but I do not think that it laid somewhere for centuries on the same spot, because usually that would leave marks on something, and we have examples of certain swords that have been touching something even for a couple of decades, and a horizontal line forms on them.
And just moisture gathers there, condensation, it's a cold morning, condensation gathers in nooks and crannies, and that's where you get, and even a famous thing is a lot of Victorian swords that I actually get through my hands have come out of wall displays, either in stately homes or people's private homes or pubs. Surprisingly, pubs used to have guns and swords up on the walls when they were less worried about crime. And in those situations, what you often get is one side of the blade is a completely different colour to the other side. And in the case of homes or pubs, it's often because of smoke in the air. So cigarette smoke from a fire, people's just sweat and breathing and oxidization, and often the side which is against the wall will actually be better, or would be lighter than the side which is
and it has to do with the material of the wall as well, because it depends on if it's against stone or wood, you'd get, or even fabric, even worse. You'd have like a very, very different result. So this tells me that the conditions of this were mostly even and possibly not lying on the blade for that long. Really. And again, we can only speculate about this.
Although we know for some of its life, because in the 1880s there were photographs taken at the Arsenal of Alexandria. So this sword around the year 1420, if I remember correctly, was passed into the Alexandria Arsenal. We know that because very kindly they put inscriptions on lots of the swords that came into that Arsenal of Alexandria.
So this was transferred or taken from the Kingdom of Cyprus.
We don't know if they were given, sold, or
taken as booty.
Won.
But we know that they made it into the Arsenal of Alexandria possibly in the early 15th century. It's an interesting sword, but to go back to the condition of these and stuff, I know we did the other video on the history of this. But I do find this fascinating because it is very early. It's in a very good condition, and for something that doesn't even have the handle. It still remains in a very good condition overall. I think the pommel is possibly the one that has suffered the most damage of it. But it's interesting because you can see on the quillons and on the pommel, you can still see the file marks that were probably part of the making process.
You can also see abrasions which, to me, look like subsequent cleaning. So my interpretation as an antique person would be that at some point this has had a light surface rust on it. And now we know, so the Royal Armouries at the moment, we're in Leeds in the Royal Armouries, but traditionally the Tower of London held this collection. And there was someone actually employed there to
basically sand all of the collection, wasn't there, at some point? Because I know there are certain armours.
Honestly, I'm not entirely sure how that happened. But it was not uncommon. I think it was quite common with most big collections to do this. And interestingly, there are armours that we know they were black from the smithy, or even blades that were only subsequently polished, even though originally they would have been left black. Because again, it has to do with the perception of the public of blades and armour being shiny.
So basically, this is in about as good a condition as you find medieval, in this case late 14th century, swords, because it has stayed in basically the same place since almost when it was made, and has been more or less looked after and probably cleaned.
And even though there are stains, and as you say, of cleaned rust and so on, it doesn't have the patina caused by extreme rust or water.
Yeah. Now, if we move to the Cinque Dea, although this is a 16th century sword and that's late 14th century, I would say that this is in poorer condition.
It is, yeah.
In terms of pitting. Now, pitting is a result of rust. So the rust essentially eats into the iron, converts the iron into corrosion, and then when that's cleaned off, you're left with a pit. So we do have some areas of pitting up here and light pitting in the rest of the blade. Now, overall, for a 16th century sword, that's in good condition. But it has obviously been subjected to moisture at some point, hasn't it?
And mind you again that this whole surface, the reason that it's in such a good quality, I mean, the quillons look incredible on this. There's no pitting, there's no signs of even heavy clean rust. This would have been in a worse condition at some point. It was polished and cleaned thoroughly, but not in a way that it would disrupt the overall form, and we know this because of especially how the marks look.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, they're very crisp actually, aren't they?
Yeah, and so I think that the heavy pitting was towards the tip here, and you can see this if you turn around, Matt, as well, on this side, on here. So again, like from an initial point, I would say that this was laid down on something, or something was on top of it.
Can I tell you my guess?
Yeah.
So this is based on lots of 18th and 19th century antiques that come through my hands. So I'm going to grab the replica at this point, and I'm going to grab the scabbard. So Royal Navy swords often exhibit very similar corrosion to this, and the reason is because you have a metal shape and then a leather or wooden leather scabbard. And so the moisture, especially if they're stood on the ground, comes up here and gathers around here. And moisture runs down here and it stops. And so with Royal Navy swords that have corrosion, it's often all around this region here. So if we look at the Cinque Dea, we've got corrosion all around there on that side and all around there on that side. So I might not be correct, but I think there's a good chance that this had a metal shape that came up about that high, and that's where the moisture gathered.
So you're saying that it gathered above the shape?
Just above the shape, because it's exactly what you see on leather scabbarded
The only
swords.
thing I would say about that is very interesting. Like the only thing I would expect with this would be more even. And something more horizontal. For me, this is puzzling because if we hold it, you can see that one of the sides here has been corroded on one side,
sort of eaten away
very heavily as
nibbled,
well, compared to the other side. And you can see it here. And I find this puzzling because even with my initial suggestion that this would be laid onto something or something was on it, this does not. This justify the erosion on this side, but this one is a bit weirder. And so if we only had the back side, I would say this was laid down on somewhere, or laid against a wall, because you know when something is displayed, often it's not like usually it's on display like this. It was slightly tilted. But again, we do not have damage on the tip on this. The other thing to consider is, having seen private collections of various people, sure, modern collectors might take care more of their objects, but if you go to historical private collections, there are swords and objects one on top of the other. And so when I mean that something was on top of it, I'm talking about somebody's collection that sword, paperweight.
Yeah. I mean, I won't.
Helmet.
I won't name the place, but I know one old family home which is used as a wedding venue now. But they have a good collection of edged weapons up on a wall, in a room where the doors are left open and where a lot of condensation gathers on them. So these poor swords and knives are very rusty on one side, where the condensation gathers.
But overall, I would say that this has not been mistreated,
No.
because we get way worse examples of, as you said, 19th century swords. So overall, this has been looked after. I do not remember when it entered the collection, so it might be well the case that this was historically part of the Royal Armoury's collection, but I do not remember.
One final thing about this, I think it's interesting that the pitting's on the blade, but as you mentioned, not really much on the guard. That could be for a few reasons. It could be because of the relative carbon content, and perhaps in the conditions this was in, maybe the sort of higher carbon steel blade attracted rust more than the probably iron guard did. The other thing is maybe the scabbard.
I was going to say, maybe your speculation there might be because of that. And finally, again, this is a bit weirder. Like, we have a heavily not heavily, like a slightly damaged handle with the plates of the Cinquedea having been chipped away. So this is probably horn. This thing, I do not know. I do not even know the conditions in which horn deteriorates, unfortunately. But I bet you that in a museum context, a conservation team will tell you if this was caused by condensation, if it was caused by force and so on, because
even frost maybe.
Even frost, it could be all sorts of things. There's the other thing to consider is that a lot of the damage on swords, we'll see this in the third sword more, is we get often on blades several nicks of in a variety of shapes and sizes. There might be very small, as if he had received a different blade, or it might be larger. I've heard more than often that this is a result of blade on blade
combat.
Yeah.
Well, that's because it's glamorous and people want to.
Yeah, but I think even when something is displayed, people want it to be this. But the truth is, we cannot know. It might be a collector or a unfortunate curator might have dropped the object.
Well, yes.
We're not saying that this happens nowadays.
Yeah, accidents happen.
Accidents do happen, though, and
that's what we have insurance for.
but no, like, all jokes aside, now we're very careful with these things. But the procedures in the past, and I mean, imagine that a lot of these things were part of private or public collections for centuries. So 100 years ago, the caretaker or curator of a collection might have been a bit more cavalier about this, and we have examples of famous American curators wearing armor, and British curators wearing armors, holding their swords, and so on and so on. And if we move now to the third sword.
Yeah, so I thought, before we look at, because the third sword's really interesting in terms of its possible preservation, let's just briefly mention archaeologically found, so river versus ground found. So we don't have an example here to show, and maybe we could look at that in the future when we get together again. But generally speaking, swords which are found in the ground, as far as I've seen, are the worst condition swords that you're going to find. So if you look at, Anglo-Saxon, Frankish graves where they've been buried, pre-Christian, where they've been buried with a sword or Francisca or a shield, it's going to be a corroded mess.
Because it's a bunch of different bio conditions plus humidity. Pressing against everything constantly. So you get the heavy pitting across the surface that takes away a lot of material, even on the ground. Like and occasionally it might rub against something for decades before it settles somewhere.
And a lot of what you get left, although it might look in the shape of a spear or a sword, isn't technically any more iron. It has been replaced by the corrosion products. So those, generally speaking, are the worst condition, but they're still amazingly informative. So, if you find something that's come out of an Anglo-Saxon grave, for example, it will still have its non-ferrous hilt components, if it has them, if they're like gold or silver. If it's organic material, it'll be gone. So this usually, sometimes you might get remains, but usually the grip and the scabbard are gone, and you might only get fragments. And the iron blade is essentially corrosion product, but X-rays can sometimes give you a better idea of what the blade looked like. For example, pattern welding before the corrosion. Water-found swords can vary a lot. Okay, so we've got at one end you've got the Mary Rose, where the salt water basically dissolved almost everything made of iron. But at the other end, you've got the Castillon swords.
I mean, like, but we do not entirely know the conditions of
No.
or how they were preserved, like, and if they even were per se water found.
No.
But I would say.
But then we could say the River Thames swords.
Yeah.
We've got some River Thames swords.
We have River Thames and daggers and so on.
Yeah.
And I think visually the characteristic. The most characteristic thing about river and water finds is the black patina you get
for fresh water.
Yeah, fresh water you get like on them.
So just sorry to cut in, but just one thing to make clear, because I think a lot of people watching this won't understand. The sword isn't, for the most part, preserved because it's just sitting in water. It's preserved because it's in the mud of the riverbank.
Yeah.
So that's what, there are certain rivers, and thankfully the River Thames is one of them, and it seems that certain rivers in France as well are very good at preserving iron because they are essentially anaerobic. They, the sort of convergence of factors in that mud stops them from being completely rusted away. Unfortunately, salt water, particularly where the Mary Rose was found, for example, where you've got a lot of movement as well. So not only is the thing in the water being corroded by salt water, but it's also being tossed and turned around by the tides and everything else, is just very, very destructive. So from the Mary Rose, we only have, despite the fact we have something like, I don't know, 100 and something bollock dagger hilts, and we've got like about 100 longbows. We've only got, I think, about 5 swords remaining, or bits like traces of 5 swords.
It's interesting to sort of, because you mentioned the Castillon swords, and as a group, it has been debated as to how precisely they were preserved. Historically, it's thought that they were in a barrel or barrels and so on, and then that was in the mud in the pores of the river. But again, that would preserve something better than being exposed directly into everything.
It would
and
chill
in the
them.
movement. But we're not entirely sure. This one it's a bit of not an oddity, but we can speculate about its conditions, and we had a nice discussion, again always on a speculative level, as to what could have caused this, because there is pitting on it, spotted, which is again these are the remnants of previous now removed rust anyway, especially on one of the 2 sides, and we'll go into it later, I think, a bit more.
Yeah, so I have to say, with my sort of 19th century and 18th century hat on, if we turn to either side really, the pitting that we've got on here, considering this is a sword from the late 15th, possibly early 16th century, is really not that bad.
No.
I see swords from the 19th century with worse pitting than this, just because they've been sat in someone's shed. So however this was kept and preserved, it wasn't that bad. I mean, in fact, it's mild enough that we can still see engraved decoration, which is which is really lightly done on the ricasso.
As we spoke in the previous video, it is possible that it's linked to a tradition that was popular in England, and it has to do with the deposit of armaments in churches.
Yeah.
The link is both direct, because of the style, that we can say with some confidence that this is likely English, but also because of its proximity in form to the Westminster Abbey sword, that we know that it was church deposit. The patina on it also sort of can conform to that idea that this was located or deposited also in a church environment at some point in its life. We do not know, unfortunately, we do not know the maker, the owner, or the conditions, but we can only speculate. But if we suppose that this was hanging in the beams above a certain grave, or especially against the stone of a humid church for a couple of centuries, I think this is very consistent.
Or on the wall.
On the wall, yeah. This is very consistent with this.
Yeah.
And swords and helmets above graves or cenotaphs, it's a practice that is even observed in English churches, even to the present day in certain cases. We have a very good display of funerary achievements and helmets, especially here in the Royal Armouries in Leeds. But we do have other known examples, and it's a practice that it was very popular in England, and I do not think it was made with any consistency. And again, I might be wrong in this, but I don't think so. I think it's England that has the most distinct tradition for this.
And it was so well established that even as early as the Black Prince's tomb, there were things being specifically made or altered purely for that purpose. So they didn't just take the person's helmet and the person's sword and put them above or in or around the tomb. In some cases, they got a helmet out of the armoury and had a crest made for it specifically for that occasion. And for example, the Black Prince's gauntlets, we think probably were just made as funerary gauntlets.
Yeah.
There's no
and
sign of
we have
gauntlets.
many helmets modified or specifically made for that.
Or adapted, and we see
15th
century helmets, old 15th century helmets, adapted in the 16th century to be used as a funeral monument. So this might be one of those. And what are the clues?
I mean, you pointed something earlier which I really like as an idea. I do not know how true that is, but I liked the discussion we had about the heavy sort of pitting on the one side only.
Yes.
And it sort of agrees to examples from the continent. That this might be a suggestion that this was not initially something to hang over to, but to be inside one and pressing against the fabric and sort of a decomposing body, causing this on one side, and then maybe removed.
I mean, so we have examples from Italy, for example.
And Spain.
Yeah, and Spain, yes, quite
Spain.
right. Yes, there's very famous, so Spain and Italy, sometimes swords were actually, the person was fully clothed, but they were wearing their sword belt and their sword. And later on in the 19th century, for the most part, the tombs were opened up for various reasons. And the sword was in there, but clearly the sword is very corroded on one side where it was against the person's body.
Yeah, so like it is possible this I don't know, with our morbid imagination we can easily see this happening, but equally the heavy pitting on one side could have been because it was hanging against something. It could have been because it was left, even on even if a church context or an arsenal context, against something here, pressing against something where condensation was gathering. An interesting contrast in this object, much like the Cinque Terre, but we can see this even more, is that the condition of the quillons and the pommel are quite different to that of the blade. And as you pointed out earlier, that might be because of the different ferric content and of these, but it might also be because the person who cleaned the sword paid more attention to the blade because it's an easier surface rather than going inside the cavity of the wheel and cleaning this more, or if they want to create sort of this distinction in the form.
Or it was in a scabbard for part of it.
Again, or it was in scabbard. Yeah, like again, since you said this as well, this would equally sort of feed into that narrative. And we have examples of church swords hanging like in the scabbards from belts.
Absolutely.
From wooden beams.
I almost, from period art, I almost think that it was probably more common that they were all originally in their scabbards. But the scabbards just fell apart and decomposed, so just
but
the sword was left.
In this case, though, the pommel, and what I am not entirely sure is because about this is because the pommel and the quillons are even more eroded than the blade itself. Which really puzzles me because, okay, like we can say that the water gathered inside the wheel or concentrated and sat here, but I'm not sure.
And the grip's gone.
The grip's gone,
yeah. So I mean, I would, again, with my sort of 19th century sword hat on, I have a lot of swords come through my hands where actually the blade's in good condition because it's in its scabbard, and the hilt is covered in rust, you know. So that would be my, if I had to put my money on something, my money would be that it would lived a lot of its time in the scabbard, and this just developed a lot of moisture.
It's possible, and the handle fell apart. It rotted from the inside from the wood.
Eaten by various little, you know, woodworm or moths.
And it is something that is also worth mentioning with these two swords here, that we have a lot of swords a bit earlier from the 15th century and before, that the organic material is gone.
Yes,
and that is either, especially in the cases where this is a find, because then the organic thing is the first that goes, like that's eaten even faster. And it's interesting to also juxtapose objects such as these to Bronze Age swords. Which are there finds, but because they have no ferric content, or no, they don't, right? Like not at all. Bronze does not rust, so it preserves perfectly in the shape, unless it is bent. It's perfectly there.
It's one of the wonderful things about Bronze Age swords. Right, that's been fantastic. I hope that has been interesting. So, I mean, you know, just to summarise, medieval and Renaissance swords tend to be in the best condition when they have been stored in an armoury, or a private collection, or a house, or sometimes a church. But church swords tend to be in worse condition because they haven't been looked after as well. Usually they're high up in the rafters or on a wall, and churches are not heated and that kind of stuff. And then the poorest condition swords are usually ground-found archaeological swords or sea-found swords. But river-found swords, as found in the Thames or possibly the Dordogne, can be actually in surprisingly good condition, even to the point where they sometimes even still have their grips as well, the organic material. And I think one of the Castillon swords here has remnants of the wood remaining on the grip, doesn't it? The two-hander. And I think one or two of the others have remnants of leather and or wood around the base of the blade as well. I think I've got remnants of the scabbard. But anyway, Iason, thank you so much. It's great being here with these original things that, you know, not many people get to handle, so I feel hugely privileged. I hope it's been interesting to you. Thank you, Iason. I hope you'll be back on the channel for something else in the future. Maybe we can, well, maybe you've got some special requests. What would you like to see or hear Iason talk more about here? But don't forget, you can get more of him and his colleagues on the Royal Armoury's YouTube channel, which will be linked down below. Thanks a lot for watching. Thank you, Iason.
Thank you, Matt.
See you back soon. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.